The Rossi Grand Hotel blazed like a crown jewel against the Milan skyline. 200 of Italy's most dangerous and most beautiful people had gathered beneath its crystal chandeliers, champagne flutes catching light like diamonds, laughter curling through air thick with perfume and ambition and quiet, invisible threat. Security moved at the edges of the room like shadows that breathed. The cameras, both the invited press and the hidden surveillance kind, tracked every entrance, every glance, every gesture. And then the doors at the top of the marble staircase opened, and the room went silent. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds before the world remembered how to move again. The dress was the color of deep burgundy, almost black in certain light, cut with the kind of deliberate audacity that announced she had nothing to prove and everything to say. It traced every line of her with elegant precision, and the way it moved when she walked, slow, unhurried, like she owned the staircase and everything beneath it, made every conversation in the room lose its thread. Cameras flashed. Heads turned. Men stopped mid-sentence. Women narrowed their eyes with the particular sharpness of those who recognized a moment when they saw one. Isabella Moretti descended the stairs like she'd been born knowing how. And across the room, standing near the far window with a glass of Barolo he hadn't touched in 20 minutes, Marco Valente saw her. Everything changed. Before we go any further, if you love dark romance, obsession, and stories that make your heart race, please like, share, and subscribe. It means everything. Now let's begin. The glass in Marco's hand didn't move. His jaw didn't tighten. His eyes didn't widen. To anyone watching him, and several people were always watching him, he looked exactly as he always did. Composed. Still. Like a man whose internal temperature never varied by a single degree. But Luca, his right-hand man, stood 2 feet to his left and had spent 11 years reading the small language of Marco Valente's body. And what Luca saw in those first 3 seconds made something cold slide down his spine. Marco's thumb had stopped moving against the base of his wine glass. He always did that when he was thinking, a slow, unconscious rotation of his thumb. It was the only tell he'd never managed to eliminate. And when it stopped, it meant one thing. Something had his absolute and undivided attention. Luca followed the line of Marco's gaze across the room. Took him 2 seconds to find her. Then he exhaled quietly through his nose and reached for his own glass. "You know her?" Luca asked, keeping his voice low and conversational, the kind of tone that wouldn't register as significant to anyone nearby. Marco said nothing for a long moment. "Isabella Moretti," he said finally. His voice was what it always was, low, even precise. But there was a weight on her name that hadn't been there a moment ago. She wasn't supposed to be here. Luca turned slightly to look at him. Supposed to be, or invited to be? Marco's eyes didn't leave her. Those aren't the same question. The Rossi Gala was not a neutral event. Everyone in the room understood that. Enzo Rossi, the man hosting this glittering spectacle in his grandfather's hotel, was Marco Valente's most calculated opponent. Not a street enemy. Not a brute with a gun and a grudge. Enzo was the kind of man who smiled with every tooth and kept his threats wrapped in silk and expensive hospitality. He'd inherited the Rossi family's network of financial holdings, political connections, and a criminal infrastructure that ran along the northern corridor of Italy like an underground river, quiet, powerful, and very difficult to dam. Marco was here tonight because not attending would have been a message of its own. In their world, presence was politics. Absence was a declaration. So Marco had come, with Luca and 2 others, dressed in a black suit that cost more than most people's cars, his neck tattoo. A coiling serpent wrapped in Italian script that read Sang Kayama Sang, blood calls to blood. Visible above the crisp open collar of his shirt. His forearms were rolled to just below the elbow, the dense black ink of his tattoos catching the light as he moved, the names and symbols that mapped the history of everything he'd built and everyone he'd lost pressed permanently into his skin. He'd walked into this room prepared for every kind of provocation Enzo Rossi could arrange. He had not prepared for Isabella Moretti in that dress. She moved through the room like she was navigating a garden party, not a battlefield. That was the thing about her, and Marco had known it from the first moment he'd encountered her, 7 months ago, At the edge of a meeting she had no business attending and handled with a composure that had annoyed him deeply. Isabella Moretti existed in the spaces between worlds. She wasn't Mafia. She wasn't civilian. She was the daughter of a man who had once served as a financial architect for 3 different crime families before quietly disappearing into retirement in Florence, leaving his daughter with an education, a modest inheritance, and an instinct for navigating dangerous rooms that she'd clearly inherited in full. She wasn't supposed to be here. Marco had told her that. 3 weeks ago, when Enzo's invitation had apparently made its way to her, through channels that were, in themselves, a message Marco had found out within 12 hours. He called her. The conversation had been brief. His side of it, at least. Don't go, Isabella. I don't take instructions from you, Marco. I'm not giving you instructions. I'm giving you information. I appreciate the distinction. I'm going. She'd ended the call. He'd stood in his office for a full minute afterward, his knuckle tattoos white where his hand had tightened around the phone, the letters FAD and FORZA, faith and strength, pressed into the skin of his right hand, and he'd made himself breathe. And now she was here, in that dress, in this room, in front of 200 people who all, in some way, answered to either him or Enzo Rossi. Luca leaned slightly closer. She's heading toward the East Terrace bar. I know, Marco said. Enzo's people are stationed there. I know, Marco said again. His thumb had resumed its slow rotation against the wine glass. Controlled. Deliberate. A man putting himself back under his own authority. Don't move yet. Isabella accepted a glass of Prosecco from the bar with a smile she'd practiced enough times that it felt genuine, because it was, mostly. She genuinely liked this kind of room. She knew that was perhaps strange for a woman who understood exactly what kind of people filled it, but she'd grown up on the edges of danger and she'd learned early that it was far more useful to find it interesting than to find it terrifying. The East Terrace was open to the Milan night, the city spreading below in a glittering sprawl, warm air moving through the space with just enough weight to remind her that August in northern Italy was still August. She turned slightly and let her gaze move through the room in the way she'd learned from her father. Never scanning, always observing. You look at one thing at a time. You notice what's adjacent to it. You build the picture piece by piece. She'd noticed Marco the moment she'd come down those stairs. Of course she had. Marco Valente at rest was more visible than most men in motion. The height, the stillness, the ink on his neck that other men in this world would have hidden under a collar and that he wore like a signature. She'd noticed him. She'd met his gaze for precisely 1 second, just long enough to confirm she'd seen him, and then she'd looked away, because that was her answer to his phone call. Not defiance. Not performance. I see you. I'm here anyway. She looked at him. The voice belonged to Enzo Rossi, who had materialized beside Luca with the particular quiet of a man who moved through his own spaces like smoke. He was 43, silver-touched at the temples, wearing a cream-colored suit with a pocket square that matched nothing in the room and everything about his personality. He had a champagne flute in one hand and an expression of profound amusement on his face. Your girl looked at Valente and then kept walking, Enzo said to no one in particular, though he was absolutely speaking to Luca, who he knew reported everything to Marco. I find that fascinating. Luca said nothing. Marco, who had heard every word, turned his head slowly and looked at Enzo Rossi. The room didn't go quiet. No one except Luca noticed the exchange. But something shifted in the air between the two men, the kind of atmospheric pressure change that preceded storms. Enzo. Marco's voice carried exactly as far as it needed to. Marco. Enzo's smile widened. He raised his glass. Glad you came. I was beginning to wonder. He let his gaze drift deliberately toward the terrace, toward where Isabella stood with her Prosecco and her burgundy dress and her complete apparent indifference to the gravity she was generating. Beautiful woman. Old friend of yours. This is a nice hotel, Marco said. Your grandfather had good taste. The deflection was so smooth it was almost elegant. Enzo recognized it, acknowledged it with a small tilt of his head, and moved on. But the message had been sent and received in both directions. Enzo knew that Isabella Moretti's presence here had landed. And Marco knew that her presence here had been engineered precisely to land that way. This was the game. And Isabella was the piece Enzo had moved onto the board. She hadn't known that. She needed to understand that clearly because it would matter later, when the night broke open and everything she thought she understood about her own independence rearranged itself. Isabella Moretti had come to this gala of her own free will. She'd dressed for it with her own confidence. She'd walked through those doors entirely on her own terms. She had not known that Enzo Rossi had sent her invitation specifically because her name appeared in surveillance documentation that his people had gathered on Marco Valente, that Isabella Moretti appeared on a short, very private list that one of Marco's men had been foolish enough to compile and careless enough to allow to be copied. A list of what one analyst had labeled, in clinical and mistaken bureaucratic language, assets of personal significance. She hadn't known she was on that list. She hadn't known what it meant to Enzo Rossi to get her into this room. She hadn't known that by accepting the invitation, even on her own terms, even in her own dress, even with her own chin raised and her own choices intact. She had walked into a move in someone else's game. Marco had known. That was why he'd called her. That was why he'd said don't go in a voice that had something underneath it she'd chosen not to examine. And now they were both here on opposite sides of a terrace, and the pieces were in motion. "Someone's watching you," said a voice to her left. Isabella turned. The woman beside her at the terrace railing was perhaps 50, dark-haired, wearing sapphires and the expression of someone who had outlasted several interesting wars. She was Giuliana Ferrante, widow of a banker who had been many other things before he was a banker, and she was one of the few people in this room Isabella actually recognized and genuinely liked. "Several people are watching me," Isabella said pleasantly. "One of them in particular." Giuliana sipped her champagne. "The kind of watching that has intent in it." Isabella didn't turn to look. She knew where Marco was. She could feel the specific quality of his attention like a change in weather. "He's always had intent in him." "Him specifically," Giuliana said. "Though I notice the other one, Rossi, is also paying attention. That's a complicated corner you're standing in, Cara." "I'm standing at a bar in a beautiful hotel," Isabella said. "I'm having a drink. I'm minding my own business." Giuliana made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "In this room, your business is never only yours." She set her glass down and touched Isabella's arm briefly, warmly. "Be careful tonight. The air has that quality." "What quality?" "The kind that precedes something breaking," Giuliana said. And then she moved away, diamonds catching the light, and left Isabella alone with the view and the city and the weight of Marco Valente's gaze pressing against her back like a hand. The first hour passed the way Gala hours did, in beautiful, dangerous slow motion. Isabella circulated. She spoke to a sculptor whose gallery was funded by money that had taken 3 continents to launder. She laughed with the wife of a politician whose career Enzo Rossi essentially owned. She accepted another glass of Prosecco and examined a centerpiece of white peonies that probably cost more than her monthly rent and felt, with every passing minute, the room's geometry shifting around her in ways that had nothing to do with the other guests. Marco had moved. Twice. She'd tracked him peripherally. A skill so internalized she no longer had to think about it, and he'd repositioned himself each time in a way that was subtle enough for the room but that she read clearly. He was maintaining sight lines. He was keeping her in view. And he wasn't coming to her. That was the part that worked on her nerves in ways she hadn't anticipated. She'd expected, what? A confrontation? A cold, quiet "I told you not to come"? Something that would let her push back, assert her ground, remind him that she was not his to manage. She'd prepared for that. She'd worn the dress partly for that. A declaration of self-possession. But he wasn't giving her the confrontation. He was giving her the silence. And somehow that was worse. Enzo Rossi reached her at 40 minutes past 10. He came with 2 glasses of champagne, offering one with the practiced ease of a man who had been charming people in expensive rooms for 2 decades. He had a smile that showed exactly the right amount of teeth and eyes that gave nothing away behind their warmth. "Isabella Moretti," he said, as if her name were a gift he was giving back to her. "I'm so glad you came." The invitation was something of a hope rather than an expectation. "Then I'm pleased to have exceeded your expectations," she said, accepting the glass because refusing it would have been a signal of its own. "You look extraordinary," he said. Not a leer. Just a statement, offered with the confidence of a man who could appraise things without appearing to appraise them. "That dress is a choice. Most dresses are." He laughed, genuinely pleased. "Your father would have approved. He had an eye for how rooms worked." He turned slightly, gesturing with his glass at the space around them. He understood that a room like this one is a theater, and that what matters isn't just what you say, but where you stand when you say it. It was a beautiful piece of conversational bait. She recognized it, an invitation to talk about her father, which would open avenues he could explore, information he could gather, leverage he could file away. "My father retired to tend his garden," Isabella said. "He finds it more honest." "Wise man." Enzo studied her with those careful eyes. "And you? Do you prefer gardens? Or rooms like this?" "I prefer," Isabella said, "to be exactly where I've chosen to be." Something passed through his expression, not quite respect, but the recognition of it. "Then you chose well tonight," he said. He held her gaze a moment longer than courtesy required. "I hope you'll allow me to show you the view from the private terrace later. The north-facing one. The city looks different from that angle." "I'll consider it," she said. He nodded, touched his glass to hers with a sound like a bell, and moved away. And the moment he was gone, Isabella exhaled. Long, slow, quiet. She turned slightly and found, without surprise, that Marco was looking at her from 30 feet away. His face was still. His eyes were not. Luca appeared at Marco's shoulder like a thought made physical. "He went to her himself," Luca said. "That's not incidental." "No," Marco agreed. His voice had gone very quiet. The kind of quiet that, in 11 years, Luca had learned to treat like a warning siren. "He invited her specifically," Luca continued. "I had confirmation 20 minutes ago from—" "I know." Marco set his wine glass down on the nearest tray with a care that was almost ceremonial. Controlled. Every movement precise. The serpent on his neck. Sang Kayama sang. Caught the chandelier light as he turned his head slightly. He found the list. Luca went still. "The personal asset documentation? Call it what it is," Marco said. "He found out she matters. And he invited her here to see what I'd do about it." The silence between them lasted exactly 4 seconds. "And what are you going to do about it?" Luca asked. Marco's knuckle tattoos, feet Forza across both hands, were visible where his hands had closed loosely at his sides. Not fists, just closed, like a man holding himself in careful custody. "I'm going to speak to her," Marco said. "Alone. She won't make that easy." "No," Marco said, and something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile. "She won't." He crossed the room the way he did everything, without hurry, without announcement, and with the effect of gravity. People shifted. Conversations paused and resumed. Eyes followed him and then looked away when he didn't look back. The crowd between him and Isabella seemed to understand, with the instinct that prey sometimes has about the direction of intention, to make a path. Isabella saw him coming. She didn't step back. She didn't adjust her expression. She turned slightly to face him and waited, holding her champagne glass with both hands the way someone holds a warm cup. Not as a prop, but because she needed something to do with her hands and she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing that. He stopped in front of her. Close. Not violating any boundary that the room would notice, but close enough that the conversation became immediately private, the ambient noise of the gala rising up around them like walls. "Isabella," he said. "Marco," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. The dress, in the chandelier light, was doing things that he was not going to let himself think about. "You came," he said. "I told you I would. You told me you were going to." There was a distinction in that, and they both heard it. "I hoped you'd reconsider. And I hoped you'd respect that I didn't." Another silence. His forearm tattoos, dense black script and symbols that she'd seen in different lights on different nights, never quite been able to read all of, were visible where his sleeve had caught on something and stayed pushed up. The ink was part of him the way his voice was part of him. She'd stopped being surprised by it months ago. Now it was just Marco. Permanent, deliberate, uncompromising. "He invited you," Marco said, "because he found out you're—" He stopped himself, started again. "Because he found out I know you." "Then it sounds like the problem is with him, not with me." "The problem," Marco said, and his voice dropped another register, going to the place it went when he was being very careful, "is that you're in his room, drinking his champagne, and he's going to use that." "Use me how exactly?" Her eyes had sharpened. "I'm a person, Marco. I'm not a chip on a board. In his mind. I don't live in his mind." She took a breath. "Or yours." The words landed. He absorbed them without visible reaction, which she knew by now meant he'd felt them more than if he'd flinched. The stillness was where Marco Valente lived when things mattered. "The private terrace," he said. "Did he invite you?" She held his gaze. "He mentioned it." Something moved behind his eyes like weather. "Don't go. You said that before. About tonight. And I was right. You were right that Enzo had a purpose for inviting me," she said, her voice even measured, holding its ground. "That doesn't mean you're right about what I should do with that information. I'm here. I'm handling it. I'm not a casualty waiting to happen." Marco looked at her for a long, long moment. "The private terrace is where he conducts business he doesn't want witnessed," he said finally. "It has no cameras and 2 exits. If you go there with him—" "I won't go there with him," she said. "I'm not an idiot. I'm aware of what he is. A beat. I'm also aware of what you are. Then you know why I'm telling you this. I know why you think you're telling me this." She met his gaze full on. "But there's a version of this where you're not protecting me, Marco. Where you're just protecting what you think of as yours." The word landed between them like something dropped from a great height. His jaw tightened. The first physical tell she'd seen from him all evening. Just the smallest, almost imperceptible tightening of the muscle below his left cheekbone. "You're not mine," he said. His voice was very quiet. "No," she said. "I'm not." Neither of them looked away. "But you came here," he said. "In that dress. To his room. Knowing I'd be here." "Yes. Why?" The question was stripped of its usual armor. Just the word, bare and direct. Isabella looked at him for a moment that stretched. Then she looked away, across the room, at the chandeliers and the beautiful dangerous people beneath them. "Because I make my own choices," she said. "And sometimes those choices happen to coincide with where you are." She turned and walked away, back toward the bar and the light and the noise. Marco stood where she'd left him, and didn't move for almost a minute. Luca appeared at his side. "How'd that go?" Luca asked. Marco picked up a fresh glass from a passing tray. He didn't answer. Luca looked at the wine glass. Marco's thumb had started its rotation again. This, Luca understood, was not reassuring. The night deepened. Midnight approached and the gala shifted, as these events always did, into the more intimate register that came when the press had been gently ushered out and the room contracted around the people who were still there because they had business with each other rather than images to maintain. The music shifted to something lower and slower. People moved to the terraces. Conversation took on the quality it had when it wasn't being performed. Isabella had found a seat near the edge of the main hall, beside a low table with a vase of white roses, and was in what appeared to be a perfectly pleasant conversation with a gallery curator and a woman who designed sets for a Milanese theater company. It was the kind of conversation she was genuinely enjoying, real and specific and about things she cared about, and she'd almost managed to rebuild the interior quiet she'd walked in with. Almost, because she could feel Marco. Still, wherever he'd positioned himself, she could feel the specific quality of his attention like a sound just below hearing. Not watching her the way Enzo's people watched her. That was assessment, calculation, the look of people treating her like information. Marco's attention felt like something else. Something she didn't have a clean word for. Possession, she thought, and immediately pushed it away. But it came back. It was the theater set designer. Camilla, warm and bright-eyed and completely unaware of the currents moving through the room, who looked past Isabella's shoulder and said, "Oh, who's that? He's been looking over here for the last 10 minutes. Don't." the gallery curator said immediately, having apparently more situational awareness than her friend. I'm just saying that is a... Camilla paused. He looks like a painting. A violent painting, but still. Isabella turned despite herself. Marco was 20 feet away, standing at the edge of a conversation he'd clearly extracted himself from, and he was looking at her. Directly. No pretense. No deflection. Just the full weight of his attention. Focused and still, like light through glass that has started, quietly, to burn. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she turned back to her conversation. "Old friend," she told Camilla, who made a sound of profound disbelief. The provocation, when it came, arrived with the precision of something that had been planned. It was 12:15. Isabella was moving toward the coat check to retrieve the small bag she'd left there, passing through a quieter corridor off the main hall, when Enzo Rossi appeared. Not alone. He had 2 men flanking him at a comfortable distance, just far enough back to be deniable as bodyguards. But the arrangement of the space was such that she would have to stop or pass very close to him. She stopped. "Reconsidering the private terrace?" he asked pleasantly. "I was getting my bag," she said. "Of course." He tilted his head. "I imagine Valente found a moment to speak with you." She kept her face neutral. "I've spoken to many people tonight." "Of course you have." His tone had something in it, not exactly a threat, but the shape of one. "I want you to understand something, Isabella." He used her first name with the ease of someone who'd decided to, not someone who'd been given permission. "Whatever Marco Valente has told you about this evening, about his concerns, those are his concerns. They're not reality. He has a habit of mistaking his own anxiety for the world's facts." "I generally make my own assessments," she said. "I know you do. That's why I invited you." He took a step, not toward her, but in a direction that subtly adjusted the geometry of the corridor. "Your father was a brilliant man. He understood that loyalty in this world is always triangulated. He served multiple interests simultaneously and managed it with complete integrity." "My father," Isabella said, keeping her voice very steady, "is retired, and not relevant to this conversation." "Of course." Enzo smiled. "I simply meant that you have excellent instincts. And excellent instincts are wasted on a man who will only ever see you as an asset to be protected." The air in the corridor changed. Not because of anything Enzo said, because Marco Valente was standing at the end of it. He'd come quietly, as he always did. He was 10 feet away, and he'd clearly heard at least the last portion of the exchange, and the expression on his face was the one she'd never seen on him before tonight. Not the cold professional stillness, not the controlled authority. Something rawer. Something that lived just beneath the surface of every careful thing he'd constructed over himself. His neck tattoo caught the corridor's low light. The serpent and its script. Sang Kayama sang. Blood calls to blood. His forearms, still slightly rolled. The ink dense and deliberate. His knuckles, feed Forza. Pale where the words pressed into the skin. "Marco," Enzo said, turning with the ease of a man who'd been expecting exactly this. Perfect timing. "I was just..." "Luca," Marco said, not looking away from Isabella. Luca materialized from somewhere and positioned himself between Enzo and the rest of the corridor with a courtesy so precise it was almost polite. "You have a guest on the south terrace," Luca told Enzo. "He's been asking for you specifically." It was fabrication. It was elegant fabrication. And Enzo recognized it and accepted it because the alternative was a scene in his own corridor, and Enzo Rossi did not do scenes. "Excuse me," Enzo said. He looked at Isabella one last time. "Think about what I said." Then he moved past Luca and was gone. And it was just the two of them in the corridor. Marco crossed to her in 3 steps. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question was quiet and direct, stripped of everything except the thing it was. "I'm fine," she said. "Nothing happened." "I know." He looked at her face, reading it the way he read everything, with complete attention, nothing held back. "What did he say?" "Before I came in. He implied that your concern for me is a form of control." She watched his face carefully. "He said you see me as an asset." Something went through Marco's expression that she couldn't fully read. It had pain in it, or something adjacent to pain. The thing pain was before it admitted itself. He said that to make you doubt me, Marco said. I know why he said it, Isabella said. That doesn't mean he's wrong. The silence between them was different from all the silences before it. More exposed. Something had been taken apart in the conversation, and neither of them had quite put it back together yet. I have a list, Marco said. She blinked. My people compiled it. People who, he stopped. His jaw was tight. His hands at his sides were very still. People who I consider important to protect. You're on it. A list. Yes. Of assets. He looked at her for a long, difficult moment. No, he said. Not assets. People who... He stopped again. Marco Valente, who always knew exactly what to say and how to say it and at what temperature to say it, stopped. People I don't want to lose. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere distant, the Gala music continued, but in here it was just this. Just them. Just the space between the words he'd said and the ones he was clearly finding almost impossibly difficult. Isabella, he said, and the way he said it, just that, just her name, was somehow the most unguarded thing she'd ever heard from him. She felt something shift in her chest. Something she'd been holding in a very particular position, maintaining its placement with great care and attention, moved. We should, she started. Don't go to the terrace, he said. Don't go anywhere alone tonight. Not because I'm managing you. Because Enzo invited you here to use your presence against me. And The words stopped. Started again with visible difficulty. As if he was pulling them out of somewhere very deep. I can't be strategic about this. I've tried for the last 3 hours and I can't. You in this room, in that dress, talking to him. He stopped. The silence was very full. What? Isabella said softly. His eyes met hers. Storm gray and very still, and for once, for this one moment in this quiet corridor, completely undefended. I can't watch him look at you, Marco said. And feel nothing. Her breath caught. Marco. I know, he said. I know what you're going to say. That it's not yours to manage. That I don't have the right. That I've never... He exhaled. You're right. About all of it. I don't have the right. But I'm standing here telling you anyway because I can't not. The music from the Gala pressed softly against the corridor walls. Isabella looked at him for a long time. What would you do? She asked quietly. If I told you I was going to go back out there and dance with someone? His jaw tightened. The knuckle tattoos whitened. The serpent on his neck seemed to coil tighter in the low light. I would stand at the edge of the room, he said, and watch, and want to destroy something. And that, she said, is what worries me. I know. It's not just jealousy, Marco. It's... She searched for the word. It's possession. And I am not. Not mine, he said. The words were rough at the edges. I know. You've said it. I've agreed with it. I'm still telling you that when he stood in that corridor with you, something in me wanted to... He stopped himself with visible effort. His hand came up briefly, the feed Forza knuckles pressing briefly to his own jaw before dropping. A gesture of restraint so private it was almost uncomfortable to witness. Isabella looked at him. At the controlled devastation of him. At the way he was holding himself together with both hands, and the effort was finally, just barely beginning to show. I need to think, she said. Take whatever time you need, he said immediately. No pressure. No demand. The response of a man who was aware, suddenly and completely, that the only way he might ever have the thing he wanted was to stop trying to take it. She nodded, turned, moved back toward the light of the Gala. And at the doorway she stopped, didn't look back. Stay in the main room, she said quietly. I'll find you before I leave. She walked back into the light. Behind her, in the corridor, Marco Valente stood very still for a long moment. Then he exhaled, slowly, and the knuckle tattoos faded from white to their usual dark as his hands relaxed, one by one. Luca appeared at the corridor's entrance and looked at him. Well, Luca said, she'll find me before she leaves. Marco said. Luca waited. That's enough, Marco said. For tonight, that's enough. But even as he said it, something in his jaw told a different story. Because the night wasn't over. And Enzo Rossi, who had been watching all of it from an angle neither of them had thought to check, was already reaching for his phone. Enzo Rossi, having witnessed the entire corridor exchange, the vulnerability, the confession, the moment Marco's armor cracked, is now making a phone call. Something has been set in motion. The night is about to break open. Enzo Rossi stepped onto the south terrace with his phone already at his ear, moving through the warm August night with the unhurried confidence of someone who has just confirmed what they suspected and is now deciding how to use it. The call connected on the second ring. She matters, Enzo said, without greeting. More than we thought. More than anything. He paused, listening. No. I want it handled carefully. I want her, yes. Arrangements for the car. Not here. After she leaves. Another pause. She'll leave alone. He won't follow immediately, too aware of the optics. That gives us the window. He looked out over the Milan skyline. The city below him beautiful and indifferent. Don't touch her. Just the conversation. I want her to understand her options. He ended the call. Looked at the city. Smiled. Isabella didn't know any of that. She was standing at the edge of the main hall, watching the room with the particular quality of observation her father had taught her. One thing at a time, build the picture, and trying to process what had happened in the corridor. I can't watch him look at you and feel nothing. She pressed her fingertips briefly to her collarbone. A small, private gesture. The words had done something to her that she hadn't been prepared for. Not because they were surprising, she'd known in the layered and indirect way that she knew most things about Marco Valente, that something existed between them. The gravitational quality of their exchanges. The way he positioned himself in rooms where she was. The 3-second silences before he answered her that felt like someone choosing very carefully. She'd known. She'd chosen not to examine it too closely because examining it meant deciding what to do with it, and deciding what to do with it meant acknowledging that it mattered. It mattered. She exhaled through her nose and straightened her shoulders. Found Marco across the room. He'd returned to the far wall, Luca at his shoulder, the picture of composed authority, the neck tattoo and the rolled forearms and the watch that cost more than most negotiations she'd ever sat in on. He was looking somewhere else. Not at her. Deliberately not at her. Which somehow made her feel his attention more. She moved toward the bar, intending to get water, clear her head, and then find him as she'd said she would. The bartender, new, she noted, not the same one from earlier, was pouring something dark over ice when a woman appeared at her elbow. Mid-30s, sharp-featured, in a dress that had clearly been chosen to be forgettable. Isabella Moretti? The woman said. Isabella looked at her. Yes. Mr. Rossi sends his apologies. He'd like to offer you transport home this evening. The city roads have become complicated and he's arranged several courtesy cars for his guests. She offered a small card. The driver is waiting at the east side entrance when you're ready. Isabella looked at the card. Something cold and quiet moved through her. She'd been in enough rooms, heard enough conversations, watched enough carefully arranged circumstances arrive wearing the costume of courtesy. She looked up at the woman. Thank you, she said. I'll keep it in mind. She pocketed the card without looking at it again. Then she turned and walked, calmly and without hurry, directly across the main hall toward Marco. He saw her coming. He'd been watching the room with the peripheral awareness that never fully switched off, and when she changed direction, when she moved toward him with that particular quality of purpose that she sometimes had, something shifted in his attention and he gave it to her entirely. She stopped in front of him. Her eyes were very level. Someone offered me a car, she said. His expression didn't change. From, he said. Rossi's people. Woman I don't recognize. East side entrance. The stillness that had been characteristic of Marco's composure all evening took on a different quality. Harder, colder, the difference between still water and ice. Luca was already gone. Not visibly. He hadn't made a production of moving, but he was no longer at Marco's shoulder, and Marco had registered where he'd gone without watching him go. You're not taking it, Marco said. Not a question. I'm not an idiot, she said. echoing her own words from earlier, from the terrace, from the moment when things had been simpler. "No," Marco said. "You're not." He looked at her for a moment. "I have a car. I know you have a car. It will take you wherever you want to go." He paused. "That includes anywhere that isn't where I am, if that's what you want." "I'm not." The knuckle tattoos flexed as his hand moved. "I'm not offering conditions." She looked at him. "All right," she said. Something moved across his face. Very controlled. Very contained. But she'd been watching him long enough to recognize it. Relief. They didn't leave immediately. That would have been a signal of its own. A retreat. A retreat that Enzo Rossi would have marked and measured and catalogued as something he'd engineered. So Marco stayed. And Isabella stayed. And for another 30 minutes they moved through the room separately but with an altered geometry between them. A different relationship to distance and direction. As if they'd both recalibrated something without naming it. Luca returned to Marco's side at 12:40. "The car at the east entrance is registered to a shell company that ties back to Rossi's logistics operation," Luca said. Quiet and close. "Driver has a record. Nothing catastrophic but enough." He paused. "And there are 2 other men positioned between the east entrance and the street. Not visible from inside." Marco said nothing. "What do you want to do?" Luca said. "We leave in 10 minutes, Marco said. "West entrance. Both cars. She goes first. I follow at distance." "And the east entrance situation?" Marco's jaw was very tight. "Document it. We deal with it later." He looked across the room to where Isabella was saying goodbye to Juliana. Their exchange warm and brief. "Not tonight. Not in front of her." Luca nodded once. "And Rossi?" Marco let his gaze travel slowly across the room to where Enzo stood near the piano, holding court with 3 people who were clearly charmed and clearly nervous at the same time. "He tried to use her," Marco said, very quietly, very evenly. "We'll have a conversation about that." The quality of those words, the flatness of them, the absence of emotion, which in Marco's vocabulary meant the presence of something far past emotion, made Luca straighten almost imperceptibly. "Understood," Luca said. At 12:50, Isabella made her way toward the west entrance. Marco moved to intercept her naturally, smoothly enough that it looked, from any angle, like coincidence. Except that Enzo was watching from across the room, and nothing about it looked like coincidence to him. She felt him fall into step beside her, his presence large and quiet, and she didn't look at him immediately, but she felt the realignment of her own body. Not toward him exactly, but no longer deliberately away. "West entrance," he said quietly. "My car is second." "Where am I going?" she asked. "Wherever you tell my driver." She glanced at him sideways. "And you?" "I go where you're not," he said. "Tonight." She absorbed that. "Why tonight specifically?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. They were moving through the corridor toward the west entrance, the ambient noise of the Gala falling behind them, and the air was cooler and the light was lower and it felt, somehow, more honest than the blazing main hall. "Because tonight was too much," he said. "For me. And you need space from that." The honesty of it hit her somewhere under her sternum. "Marco, get in the car, Isabella," he said. Not a command. Something gentler. "Get home safe. And then, when you've had some space, we can talk. Actually talk. Not like this. Not in the middle of something he built." She stopped walking. He stopped with her. She looked at him in the low corridor light. The serpent on his neck. The ink on his forearms. The feed forza of his knuckles. All of it permanent and chosen and deliberate. A man who had decided who he was and pressed it into his own skin. "You said you couldn't feel nothing," she said. "I said it. I need you to understand something too," she said. "I came tonight because I make my own choices. But the dress," she stopped. Her eyes held his. "The dress was partly because I knew you'd be here." He was very still. "That's not me being yours," she said. "That's me being," she exhaled, "complicated, and confused about it, and trying to figure out what I actually want. That's all I'm asking for," he said. "Time for you to figure it out. And if I figure out I want to stay exactly as we are, Then we stay exactly as we are, he said. And I continue being very bad at not looking at you. Something broke open in her chest. Not pain, not quite joy, but the thing that happens when something you've been holding very tightly is allowed to relax for the first time. She let out a small, involuntary breath that was almost a laugh. He looked at her, and the storm-gray eyes had something in them that she would think about later, on the way home, in the dark of the car, with the city sliding past the windows. Go, he said softly. Let me know when you're home. She nodded, turned, walked through the west entrance and into the night. He watched her go. Luca was at his shoulder in moments. She's in the car. Driver confirmed route. 2 minutes clear. Good. And Rossi's east entrance team? Marco turned. The expression on his face had changed completely. The warmth, the particular complicated warmth that only appeared in his face in a very narrow set of circumstances, was gone. Replaced by the professional stillness. The controlled, cold authority that the people in his world spent a great deal of energy fearing. Tell me what we know, he said. What they knew, as it turned out, was enough. In the 40 minutes that followed Isabella's departure, Luca's people gathered and compiled. The shell company, the driver's background, the names of the 2 men at the east entrance, the phone call Enzo had made from the south terrace. Not its content, not yet, but its duration and recipient, enough to triangulate the network. It was precise and methodical, and it was the kind of work that Marco Valente's organization did better than almost anyone in their world, because Marco had always understood that information was the instrument and violence was the last resort. He didn't go back into the Gala. He didn't need to. He knew Enzo knew he was still there. His car hadn't moved, which was information, and that Enzo was recalibrating whatever the evening had been intended to accomplish. At 1:15 in the morning, Marco's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. I'm home. He looked at those 2 words for longer than was strictly necessary. Then he typed back. Good. A pause. Then, from her, how are you? He thought about that for a moment. Standing in the west corridor of the Rossi Grand Hotel. His neck tattoo and his forearm ink and his knuckle letters all visible in the quiet light. In the black suit in the still air of a night that had been many different things. Complicated, he typed. And figuring something out. Another pause. Me too. Then, good night, Marco. Good night, Isabella. He pocketed his phone. We're leaving, he told Luca. And Rossi. He'll hear from me, Marco said. Not tonight, but very soon. They walked out through the west entrance and into the Milan night, and the city moved around them the way cities do. Indifferent, continuous, bright with its own business. And Marco got into his car and looked at the lights for a moment before the driver pulled away. He thought about a dress the color of burgundy descending a staircase. He thought about a corridor and a confession and the specific relief of having said something true after a very long time of not saying it. He thought about Sang Kayama Sang, blood calls to blood, pressed permanently into the side of his neck. He thought, something has to change. 3 days passed. They were not simple days. In the architecture of the world Marco inhabited, 3 days without contact following the kind of evening the Gala had been could mean anything, reconciliation, recalibration, or the quiet building of consequences. He managed his business with the usual precision, the forearm tattoos visible in every meeting, the knuckle letters present at every table, the neck serpent above every open collar. Nothing in his professional presentation changed. But Luca watched him and said nothing, which was Luca's way of saying a great deal. The Enzo situation was being carefully constructed. Marco's legal and investigative team were documenting the shell company, the car, the east entrance arrangement. It wasn't enough to move on directly, not yet, not with the political insulation Enzo had built, but it was being assembled with the patience that Marco understood as the most powerful weapon he possessed. Enzo thought the Gala had given him something. Marco was making sure it had given him nothing. On the second day, there was a message from Enzo himself. Smooth, courteous, referencing a potential business matter that wanted a meeting. Marco had Luca acknowledge it with equal smoothness and no commitment. On the third day, Isabella called. He picked up on the second ring. I've been thinking, she said. I know, he said. You can't know that. I've been thinking too, he said. And when I'm thinking about the same things you are, It's usually mutual. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear the ambient sound of wherever she was. Outdoor, he thought. Terrace. Wind and distant city noise. Can we meet? She said. Somewhere that isn't a gala or a corridor or any kind of room that belongs to anyone. Name it. She named a small restaurant near the Navigli. Nothing significant, nothing political, just a place with good food and a terrace over the canal and tables far enough apart that conversation stayed private. He knew it. He'd never been, which made it hers in a way that felt right. 7? She said. 7, he said. He arrived at 6:55 and chose a table at the edge of the terrace where the canal moved below in the early evening light, golden and slow. He dressed differently. Still the black suit, he always wore the black suit, but the shirt was slightly more open, the jacket set aside almost immediately. The forearm tattoos were fully visible, the ink dark against his olive skin in the warm light, the neck tattoo above the open collar, the knuckle letters as he wrapped his hand around a water glass. He looked like what he was. He'd stopped trying not to. Isabella arrived at 7 exactly. She was wearing something simple, not a gala dress, not a statement. Just herself in a way that somehow hit harder than the burgundy had, because it was quieter and real and she hadn't dressed for a room. She'd dressed for an evening. For dinner. For him. She sat down across from him and looked at him and he looked at her and for a moment neither of them said anything, because the evening had a specific quality, warm and possible, that neither wanted to rush. You look, he started. Don't, she said, but she was almost smiling. We'll get there. Talk first. He looked at the canal. All right, what do you want to say? She folded her hands on the table. The gesture was deliberate, organizing herself. He watched it. I've been thinking about what you said. In the corridor. About not being able to feel nothing. Yes. And I've been thinking about what I said. About not being yours. She met his eyes. I said it because I meant it. And I still mean it. I'm not something you can have or manage or protect as a category of your property. I know, he said. But, she exhaled. There's a difference between being someone's possession and choosing to be someone's. She held his gaze steadily. I've spent 3 days trying to figure out if what's between us is the first thing or the second thing. He was very still. And, he said, and I think, she said carefully, that you spend a lot of time treating it like the first thing, not cruelly, not intentionally, but, she searched for the words. You put me on a list of people to protect, without asking me, without telling me, without. I know, he said. The words were quiet and direct. That was wrong. She blinked. Whatever she'd been prepared for, easy acknowledgement hadn't been it. I know it was wrong, he said again. I know that's not. That doesn't mean you're not. He stopped. His hand, the feed forza hand, pressed briefly to the table. I was protecting the feeling rather than you. I was protecting what it would cost me if something happened to you, which isn't the same thing as. He stopped. It's not the same thing. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. When did you figure that out? She said. 3 days ago, he said. In the corridor. When you said I was protecting what I thought of as mine. He looked at her directly. You were right. And I've been sitting with that. The canal moved below them. The evening light was doing things to the water and the air and the moment. I don't want to be on a list, Isabella said. You're not anymore, he said. What am I then? He looked at her for a long moment. Someone I'd like to ask, he said. If she's willing to be in my life. On her own terms. Not on mine. She was quiet for a long time. That's a very different offer than the one you were making 3 days ago, she said. I'm making a different offer, he agreed. What does it look like? She said. Your life, if I'm in it. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, gathering. It looks like this, like dinner near a canal, and some conversations you'll hate and some you won't, and a world that has edges you'll have to know about. And, he exhaled, and me trying to give you information before I make decisions, and asking instead of deciding, and being very bad at all of it for a while and trying anyway. Her eyes were warm. You'll be bad at it. Catastrophically, he agreed. She almost laughed. It broke through for just a moment, real and warm and unguarded, and then she settled it back. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking. They ate dinner. The conversation found its way to other things, the restaurant's food, the canal, a book she'd been reading, a city he'd been to recently that she'd always wanted to see. It was the most ordinary meal he could remember having in years. He sat with his forearm ink on the table in the warm light and the serpent visible at his collar and the letters on his knuckles, and none of it felt like armor. Felt like him. Just him. At the end of the evening, they stood at the edge of the canal and watched the light fade from the water. Marco, she said. Yes. I'm going to say yes, she said, to being in your life. But I need you to understand what that means. He turned to look at her. It means I'm not protected property. I'm a person who chooses to be here. And if you stop treating me like the second thing and start treating me like the first thing again. She met his eyes. I'll leave. I know, he said. I mean it. I know you mean it. He held her gaze. I know what it costs you to say it. I know what it costs me to hear it. He paused. That's how I know it's real. She looked at him for a long moment in the fading canal light. Then she nodded. Once. All right then, she said. Something shifted in his face. The controlled relief of a man who has been holding himself very carefully for a very long time. All right, he echoed. The Enzo situation came to its conclusion 12 days later. It didn't come loudly. Loud was not Marco's way. It came in the form of documents delivered to 3 separate regulatory offices, financial records, surveillance logs, the details of the shell company and its connected operations, compiled with the kind of meticulous precision that Marco's team had spent those 12 days building. It came in the form of certain political relationships Enzo had relied on suddenly having other priorities. It came in conversations that happened in rooms Marco wasn't in, between people who understood that Marco Valente had made himself very clear on a particular subject without ever having to make himself audible. Enzo Rossi's position didn't collapse. That would have been too visible, too brutal, too much in Marco's way to attract the kind of attention that complicated things. Instead it contracted. Quietly. The way a business contracts when its supply lines are interrupted. When its partnerships become suddenly uncertain. When the infrastructure it relied on becomes unreliable. A message reached Enzo through appropriate channels. Isabella Moretti is not a piece on any board. If she is touched, approached, or used in any capacity by you or your network, everything that has been documented becomes public. Consider this a professional understanding between 2 businessmen. Enzo read the message, sat with it, and then did what intelligent men in his position did when they recognized a line they could not profitably cross. He let it go. He never contacted Isabella again. Marco told her about it. Not immediately, he gave it a week, wanting to be sure it had held before he said anything. And when he did tell her, he told her everything. The list, the documentation, the arrangement he'd made, the message to Enzo. They were on her apartment terrace. She'd invited him for dinner that she'd cooked, which had surprised him enough that he'd arrived 5 minutes early just to be sure he'd gotten the day right. And he told her all of it while the city moved below them, and she sat across from him with a glass of wine and listened. She was quiet for a long time when he finished. You documented everything and used it to contain him, she said. Yes. Not to destroy him. Not yet, he said honestly. Destruction has a cost. Containment is more practical for now. She looked at him. You're explaining your reasoning. I said I would. She looked down at her wine. And the list. The original list. With my name on it. Destroyed, he said. The document and the copies. All of them. All of them. She was quiet again. You know, she said finally. You could have told me about the list months ago, when you first found out Enzo had accessed it. Yes, he said. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. The neck tattoo was visible in the soft light of her terrace. The forearm ink dark against his skin. The knuckle letters, Feed Forza, resting on the table between them, close to but not touching her hand. Because telling you meant admitting you were on it, he said. And admitting you were on it meant having a conversation I wasn't ready to have. About what? He looked at her directly. About why your name was on a list I'd never even told anyone to make. She looked at him. It wasn't ordered? She said. No, he said. One of my analysts compiled it based on his own observations of my behavior. He paused. It was accurate. That was the problem. She sat with that for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his. Just that. Her hand over the feed for the knuckles. Warm and present and deliberate. He looked at her hand. Then at her face. I'm not going anywhere, she said. For the record. He turned his hand under hers so they were palm to palm. His grip was careful and complete. I know, he said. They sat on her terrace as the city did what cities do, breathing and glittering and indifferent to the specific and enormous thing happening on one particular terrace on one particular evening. And it wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a ceremony. It was just the truth of two people who had stopped managing the distance between them and were sitting in what was left when the management fell away. It was 2 months after the gala when Marco asked her. Not in a grand way. Not in the manner of a man who saw occasions as performances. He'd spent his life around people who did that and had always found it faintly hollow. He asked her in the kitchen of his apartment, which she'd been to enough times that she moved through it with the ease of someone who knew where things were. He was making coffee. She was reading something at the counter. The morning was ordinary. He set down the coffee and turned and looked at her. Isabella. Not looking up. I want to ask you something. She looked up. Read whatever was in his expression, and she was better at that now, at reading the small language of him, and set down what she was reading. All right, she said. He leaned against the counter. The forearm tattoos visible as always, the neck tattoo, the knuckle letters. Just him. Permanent and deliberate and unguarded in a way that would have been impossible 4 months ago. I know you're not mine, he said. I know that's the foundation of anything real between us. It is, she said. And I know that asking this is. He stopped. Something moved through his expression. It's not a possession. It's not me deciding something about you. It's me asking you a question. She was very still. Then ask it, she said quietly. He held her gaze. Will you stay? He said. Not temporarily. Not until something better or simpler comes along. Permanently. However we define that. However you need to define that. He paused. I'm not asking you to be in my world the way people in my world are usually. I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I'm asking if what you are wants to be here. With me. The kitchen was quiet. Morning light moved through it. That's not quite a proposal, she said. No, he agreed. It's something else. It's whatever you need it to be, he said. I'll make it a proposal if you want one. I'll make it anything. She looked at him for a long, measured moment. A vow, she said. I don't need a ceremony. I don't need the formal. I just need to know that you mean it. Permanently. I mean it permanently, he said. Then I'll stay permanently, she said. The words were simple. They landed the way simple true things land. Not with drama, but with the weight of permanence. Like something pressed into skin. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and his hands came up, the feed forza knuckles brushing her jaw with a care that was completely at odds with the power of them, and he looked at her from close up, the storm-gray eyes very still and very honest, and she put her hand flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was steady and real and entirely human. Just so you know, she said, you're still going to be bad at this. Catastrophically, he agreed. And I'm going to call you on it every time. I'm counting on it, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light continued to do what morning light does, illuminating things without commentary. She went up on her toes and kissed him. Just once, soft and deliberate and chosen, and then settled back and looked at his face, and what she saw there was the thing she'd been watching assemble itself over 7 months. In galas and corridors and canal-side dinners and kitchen mornings. It was a man who had spent his entire life constructing walls, who had pressed his identity into his skin so it couldn't be taken from him, who had built an empire on control and discipline and the relentless management of everything he couldn't afford to lose, and who was, in this kitchen, in this morning, choosing to take one of the walls down. Not all of them. He was still Marco Valente. The world he lived in was still the world it was. The serpent would still coil on his neck. The ink would still map his history on his forearms. The letters on his knuckles would still mean what they'd always meant. But here, in this particular space with this particular woman, the wall was down. And what was behind it, it turned out, was not the controlled devastation she'd glimpsed in corridors and galas. It was just him, trying, imperfectly, permanently. The months that followed weren't simple. They never would be. The world Marco inhabited didn't simplify itself because two people in it had made a private vow over morning coffee. There were meetings she didn't attend and decisions she wasn't consulted about, and evenings when he came home. Yes, home, they'd stopped pretending his apartment wasn't that for both of them, with a heaviness that she understood to be the weight of his world and that she'd learned to not try to lift, just to sit beside. And there were other things. Good things. The way he made coffee, always too strong, always exactly right. The way he read, entirely absorbed, the forearm tattoos visible on the armchair, the knuckle letters against the cover of whatever book he'd been recommended by someone he'd never name. The way he listened when she talked, not with the professional attention he gave to information, but with the personal attention that meant he was filing something away in the part of himself that wasn't business. He tried. Imperfectly, as promised. He caught himself being managed and stopped. He came to her with information before he made decisions that touched on her life. He was, as he'd predicted, catastrophically bad at it for a while. And then, gradually, he was less bad. And she called him on things. Clearly. Without apology. And he heard it. Not always immediately, not always gracefully, but he heard it, every time. It was not a simple love story. It was the only kind worth having. On a Tuesday evening in October, for months after the gala, they were sitting on his apartment terrace. The city below was doing its October thing, cooler now, beautiful in a different way, when she asked him about the tattoos. She'd been meaning to ask for months, and something about the specific quality of the evening made it feel like the right time. "Tell me about them," she said. "All of them." He looked at his own forearms for a moment. He was used to them. They were like his face to him, just his. But he looked at them through her eyes for a moment and thought about what they said. "This one," he said, turning his right arm so she could see the script that ran from his inner wrist to his elbow. Dense Italian lettering in a style that was somewhere between liturgical and street. "Is from Dante. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. In the middle of the journey of our life." He paused. "I had it done the year I took over from my father. I was 31. It felt appropriate." She traced it with one finger. Just lightly. "And this one." The symbol on the back of his forearm. Something geometric and contained. A square with something inside it. "That's older. Teen. My uncle's symbol. He died when I was 17. I put it there so I'd see it every time I worked." She looked at the knuckles. "Feed. Forza. Faith and strength," she said. "Yes. Do you believe in faith?" He thought about it. "I believe in the version of faith that doesn't require certainty. That keeps moving in the right direction even when you can't see where it goes." He looked at her. "Like this." She looked at him. "And the neck tattoo," she said. "Sang Kayama sang. Blood calls to blood," he said. "My family's expression. The idea that you can't escape where you come from. That it'll call you back." He paused. "I used to think that was a warning. Now I think it might be something else." "What?" "That the things that matter most have a way of finding their way to you," he said. "Whether you manage it or not." She looked at him in the October light. "You're getting philosophical," she said. "I'm blaming you for that," he said. She laughed. Really laughed, warm and unguarded. And the sound of it moved through the terrace and out into the city. And Marco Valente, Mafia boss, underworld architect, man of controlled devastation and permanent ink and storm-gray eyes. Marco Valente looked at her laughing and felt something in his chest that he'd spent 37 years not having a word for. He had a word for it now. He didn't say it. Not yet. There was time. They had decided that there was time. But it was there, real and permanent, pressed into him the way the ink was pressed into his skin. Indelible. He said it 3 weeks later. Not dramatically. Not with the construction of an occasion. They were walking along the Navigli on a Sunday, back near the restaurant where they'd had that first real dinner, and she'd said something that made him stop walking, and he'd turned to her, and the city was moving around them, and the canal was doing its October thing, and the words came out of him without management or strategy or careful placement. "I love you," he said. She stopped too. Looked at him. He met her eyes. The neck tattoo above his collar. The forearm ink visible below his rolled sleeve. The knuckle letters that said faith and strength. Just him, in the middle of a Sunday, on the edge of a canal, saying the truest thing he'd ever said. "I know," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "I've known for a while," she said. "I was waiting for you to figure it out." "How long is a while?" "The corridor," she said. "At the gala. When you said you couldn't watch him look at me and feel nothing." She held his gaze. "That was it. I knew then. And you've been waiting 2 months for me to say it?" "For months," she corrected. "But who's counting?" He looked at her. "I love you too," she said. "For the record." The words landed the way true things always land. Not like explosions, but like something finally setting down after a very long time aloft. He pulled her toward him, gentle, unhurried, asking rather than taking, and she came, and he held her there on the edge of the Navigli Canal on a Sunday in October while the city moved around them and the water moved below and the ink on his skin caught the light and everything was permanent and chosen and real. That winter, Marco stood at the window of his office, the office where he managed his world, where the documents lived and the decisions were made and where the walls were high and very deliberately maintained. And he looked at the city below and thought about blood calling to blood. About things that found their way to you whether you managed them or not. Luca knocked twice and came in. "Everything's quiet," Luca said. "The Rossi situation is holding. Nothing new from the east." "Good," Marco said. "And Isabella?" Luca asked because Luca asked everything eventually. Marco turned from the window, the serpent at his neck, the forearm ink, the knuckle letters, all of it permanent and real. "She's coming for dinner," he said. "Don't schedule anything after 7. Luca allowed himself a small smile that he would have denied if asked about it. "Understood," he said. She arrived at 7 with food she'd bought at the market and an opinion about something she'd read that she wanted to argue with him about, and he opened the door and looked at her and felt the word that had found its way to him on a Sunday canal side settle deeper into him, as permanent as ink. She came in, set things down, turned to him. "You look," she started. "Don't," he said. Her eyes sparked. "You said that." "We'll get there," he said. "Talk first." She laughed. The warm, unguarded laugh that moved through whatever room she was in and changed its temperature. She laughed, and he watched it, and thought, "This is what I would protect. Not as property, not as an asset, but as the thing worth being better for." "All right," she said, unwrapping the market things, moving through his kitchen with the ease of someone who knew where everything was. "Then talk." He leaned against the counter, crossed his arms, the ink visible in the kitchen light. Just him. "You were right," he said. "About the dress." She looked up. "What about it?" "It wasn't a declaration at me. It was a declaration for yourself." He held her gaze. "I know the difference now. I understand the difference now." He paused. "I spent a long time not understanding the difference." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. "That's very evolved of you," she said. But her eyes were warm. "I'm working on it," he said. She set down what was in her hands and crossed the kitchen and stopped in front of him. Put her hand flat against his chest, right where his heartbeat was, the way she'd done that morning months ago that had changed the register of everything. "Marco Valente," she said. "Isabella Moretti," he said. "We're going to be very complicated." "Catastrophically," he agreed. "But we're going to be very real." "Yes," he said. "That's the one thing we're definitely going to be." She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen was warm and the city was outside and the ink was permanent and the love was real and the permanence was chosen and none of it was simple and all of it was worth it. "Good," she said, and she kissed him again. Less brief this time, more certain, the kind of kiss that doesn't ask whether it belongs there. And the feed forza of his hands was very gentle where they came up to hold her, and the sang kayama sang of his neck was just a reminder now, a warm one, that some things find their way home whether you direct them or not. Blood calls to blood. Home calls to home. And she had called him home without knowing she was doing it. Without intention. Without strategy. Just by being exactly, defiantly, permanently herself. Which was, it turned out, everything. The end. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, made your heart race, or kept you up past your bedtime, please like this video, share it with someone who loves a dark romance, and subscribe so you never miss a story. Your support means everything. Until next time.